Well, hello everyone. Just going to begin by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay our respects to those who've kept story and knowledge on this country strong and thank them for the generosity with which they share this country. Thank you so much for being here today and welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival 2024, and a shout out to those who are joining us on Zoom, including those throughout New South Wales who are attending through local libraries. This panel is called Sins of the Fathers and asks us what happens if you discover there is murder in your family tree. So to explore this question, we have two highly acclaimed authors and contributors to public debate, David Marr and Matthew Condon. Before I launch in, I've just got a couple of housekeeping rules for you. Please mute your phone and don't record the session, please, but you are invited to take photos, and if you do, please turn your flash off so you don't blind our lovely speakers and distract them from their trains of thought. The festival would encourage you to share on social media and tag on Facebook at Bad Crimes Sydney or hashtag Bad Crimes Sydney. And so that you can hear more of the panel, you might be aware, if you've been to other sessions, that BAD this year is trialling not having audience questions as a result from feedback from audiences from previous years. You're welcome to talk to the speakers afterwards, particularly if you're asking them to sign one of their books. And I think people know that about you, David. So get them to sign. Buy a book and get them to sign it. You can ask a question then as well. And if you're not happy with that, you can give further feedback to the festival about that. I feel like both David and Matthew don't need much introduction, but I'm going to do a little introduction before we launch in. Of course, David Marr is one of Australia's, in my opinion, leading public intellectuals. He's written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Saturday Paper, The Guardian, The Monthly. He has been the editor of the National Times, reporter for Four Corners, presenter of ABC TV's Media Watch. So one question we won't be able to ask you because there's no question is who's going to be the new host of Media Watch. But of course, David has also written a range of books. Patrick White, A Life, The High Price of Heaven, Dark Victory with Marion Wilkinson. He's done 6 best-selling quarterly essays. And his most recent book is this wonderful account of his family killing for country, which is what we're going to talk about today. He's been recently appointed as host of Radio National's Late Night Live, so you can hear lots of David there, chatty. But, you know, I think what's worth remembering is in that body of work, David has been somebody who's always been a great critic or reflecting deeply on the sort of Australia we have, and that makes his work particularly rich. Matthew Condon is also a prize-winning Australian novelist and journalist. He's written some extraordinary books, but he's also written for a range of newspapers as well, the Sydney Morning Herald, Sun Herald, Melbourne Sunday Age and the Courier Mail. He's written 10 books of fiction. And I'm going to just give a bit of a shout out. I took these from my own library, so you can see I am a fan of Matthew's. He did this wonderful trilogy, which I'm going to ask him one question about, which starts with 3 Crooked Kings and goes to Jackson Jokers and All Fall Down, which looks at Queensland cops, Terry Lewis, crime, corruption. I don't know how it was only 3 books. There's a lot in there, Matthew. I love this trilogy. It's really fantastic. So highly recommend that. He's also written a couple of other books that are worth noting, Little Fish Are Sweet, and his most recent novel, I understand, is The Night Dragon. But I'm also going to give a little shout out to this book of his that I love, which is a book about Brisbane, which is a really lovely account of the city, but also of Matthew's life and connections there. And he's going to be, I should note, host of 2 podcasts Ghost Gate Road and Dig Sirens Are Coming. So also very accomplished. So I thought before we delve into the books and the writing that we're going to talk about, I would just sort of set the stage with both of you and get you to talk a little bit about where you grew up, and I guess particularly for you, David, what shaped your worldview, particularly your sense of sort of social justice and commentary about the kind of Australia you want to be. And Matthew, for you, also where you get your sense of right and wrong from, and what leads to your interest in true crime. But I'll start with you, David.
I grew up in Pymble. I'm one of the last fluent speakers of Pymble, and I do simultaneous translation for the younger staff members at the ABC. I'm valued on the staff for that capacity. So I grew up with a creek in my backyard, and I went to Shaw, which at the time was a truly terrible school. The headmaster was my uncle. The school was appalling, but it had in it half a dozen teachers, a couple of whom were superb teachers, and a history teacher rescued my life. He made me feel for the first time, and by that time I was in my final year at school, he made me feel that learning could be thrilling, and that discovery changed my life. He was also highly moral. He was an Englishman. We sort of discovered he was a follower of the British Liberal Party. He scorned the royal family. I was shocked as a 16-year-old to hear him condemn the Duke of Edinburgh for wearing makeup for the photographers, and it was just this bitter condemnation. Makeup, they wear makeup. All of that, and I was also deeply imbued with Sydney Diocese Anglicanism, which is kind of indistinguishable from Methodism, really, and all of that was important in my upbringing. But more important than that were two things. My father was a very decent, honest, implacable man. He was an employer of people. He had about 200 people working for him. And a big part of our upbringing as children was our relationship with the men who worked for him and for our family. And that can be condemned very easily as sort of capitalist privilege. But it was in fact a lesson that I know almost of no one else sharing, of respect and gratitude for the people who work for you, and the need to honour what they have to do. And that was very important to me. My father came from a Presbyterian family, the Marrs are Scots, and he had also a plain, decent morality, which was very, very strong. My mother was skittish, she's a good woman, skittish, camp, very, very, very into respectability in a way that my father couldn't give a damn about. But my mother was deeply imbued with the need for respectability, so much so that I was forced to write with my right hand, because left-handers didn't. And that was always there, and it's no wonder that it's her family I'm writing about in that book, not my father's family. But the other thing was that I grew up knowing that I was gay, or fighting the fact that I was gay. I ended up marrying somebody I loved and loved for all her life, but I was humiliated at the prospect of being known to be less than respectable as a gay man. And when you grow up gay at a time when having sex with another man is actually a capital crime, you start to question the morality expressed through the law. And that for me was really the eye-opener. If I'd been straight, I'd be a very happy, just retired district court judge now. but I was gay, and that meant that all of the fundamentals of the society that I was facing were up for questioning.
Thank you. Matthew.
Gosh, how unremarkable my life seems, Your Worship.
Unremarkable was what I wished for deeply.
Quite a boring upbringing, I think. I was a twin sister. She was the sort of child that was the first to rise up and run around the room and talk and scream, and I would be sitting in the corner. Still to this day, my twin sister, she could walk into this room and know half of your names by the end of the session. She would be watching, observing exactly what you're wearing, your shoes, who had what on their lapels, etc. So she's extraordinary eye for detail. So I sat and watched, which, maybe why I do what I do. Suburban Brisbane, parents, mum and dad were both from, not impoverished, but they were very solid working class families and origins, which my dad clawed out of. Funnily enough, I only found out recently that when he was about 21, he actually started a novel. My God, hard to believe, looking at my dad and what he did in business and had car yards, and to think that he actually embarked on a novel.
Have you got it?
No, unfortunately. But my mother's mother, my grandmother, who was featuring a lot in my thinking about this book I'm working on in terms of the murderer in the family tree. My grandfather, my mother's father was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s. He could not get a job in Brisbane. He became a handyman working under the house, fixing neighbours' toasters. He invented the world first ever fiberglass motorcycle helmet, which he called the skid lid. And he didn't have enough money to patent it. And it was in the paper, and there was a photograph of a truck balanced on 4 of the skid lids to prove how strong it was.
And he didn't patent it?
He didn't have 2 cents to rub together. My life could have been very different, David. But my grandmother, his wife, my mother's mother, she worked as a cleaner for the wealthy ladies of Brisbane over in Ascot and Hamilton. And I never forgot a story she told me. She said, one year, one of the ladies gave me a Christmas present, and it was one of her discarded mink stoles as a gift. And my grandmother said, I looked at her and I said, where on earth would I wear this? And I never forgot that story. When near the end of my grandfather's life, I remember an ALP member in Brisbane, Manfred Cross, employed my grandfather as a courier just to give him some money. I'm forever grateful to Manfred Cross. But I think it was from my grandmother's and my grandfather's side that the scales came back, and to look at the balance of fairness and justice in the community. My grandfather died when I was 10 months old, so I never, truly met him. And this is a funny story. When he was obsessed with cameras, like a lot of people in the 40s and 50s, the Brownie cameras. And so he built a little dark room under the house where he'd develop his films. Now, when I was 12, so effectively 11 plus years after he died, I was exploring the dark room, which, no one entered, and it was dusty. And I, for some reason, reached up onto this top shelf, and I found a canister of film, one of those long rolls. And at school, we were doing photography. So I took this film thinking, I wonder if it's, if I could develop it, if it's been affected by light or... So I remember we were in the darkroom at school and we developed and fed this roll into the trays, and these images appeared. And it was photographs of me and my twin sister as babies lying on my mother's chest upstairs in my grandmother's room. Would have been a month before he died. And they'd been waiting there for 12 years for me to find. And a lot of things about him come and go, interesting things, which led to my first book, The Motorcycle Cafe. But I've now gone back to that book for the first time in 30 odd years. And I've found dozens of seeds that I didn't recognize in the moment that have led to this story.
How wonderful. I want to get into the family stories and the theme of our panel today. But I did say at the beginning that I did want to ask you something about this extraordinary trilogy that you'd written, because it seems that you're here and I love this trilogy and it would be remiss of me not to ask a question. And I just wondered if you could perhaps talk about how it was that you got drawn into writing Three Crooked Kings. Did you know at the time it would end up a trilogy? The third book, of course, sort of culminates with the Fitzgerald inquiry. How did you become sort of the chronicler of Terry Lewis and Queensland corruption?
Was absolutely an unforeseen car crash of how it happened. A great friend of mine was writing a book on when famous people first met each other, and he decided he would do an essay on when Joh Bjelke-Petersen first met Sir Terence Murray Lewis, the former commissioner. So he wrote, very old-fashioned, wrote to Sir Terence in his house in Stafford Heights in northern Brisbane, and went over to visit Sir Terence. Terry's wife, Hazel, Lady Hazel, had just died some months before, and Terry said to my friend, "Would you be interested in writing my book?" And my friend said, "No, but I know a guy that might be interested," and that was me. So, of course, curiosity, I could not resist going to see the fallen knight, Sir Terence, living alone in this little brick house in Brisbane. Went to see him, and 14 years later, this story is still hanging around my neck. This week, 3 people have messaged me and emailed me. It's relentless. It never stops. When the trilogy came up, it was like a lightning rod. People come to me with stories. Just days ago, this woman said, "My brother was 17 in 1980 when he was sexually assaulted by a district court judge in 1980 on the Sunshine Coast." Now, I remember that case. The judge was found not guilty by the jury. But this woman said, "This has weighed very heavily on my brother. It's changed his life. He now feels, after 44 years, that he would like to tell someone the true story. Are you interested?" So I get dozens and dozens and dozens of these relentlessly, these requests, courtesy of the trilogy. But I interviewed Terry for 3 years, interviewed way over 1,500 people for the books. Near the end, when Terry cut ties with me, he said, "Why did you go and talk to other people? Why did you need to do that?" And of course, he died last year, Sir Terence. And his funeral was a great celebration of an heroic and honest life. Quite unbelievable.
Thank you. David, let's move on to your book, Killing for Country. Can you tell us about how you came to write it and what sort of crimes you found in your family?
I came to write it because I discovered that my great-great-grandfather had been an officer in the Native Police in Queensland. And I discovered that because my last surviving uncle had got a bit of a taste for family history. He wanted the family to all gather at a little dot in central New South Wales called Barnbar, which is where his parents met. And because they were both brought up on farms near Barnbar. And he said, look, I know nothing at all about my great-grandmother, about my grandmother, Maud Ewer, and can you dig out some stuff? Now, looking back, I realise my mother was a great one for deciding what was vulgar and what we shouldn't waste our time with. And her joke was to call it common. And she thought that people who spent a lot of time investigating their families' histories were a bit vulgar, and it was a naff thing to do. And I'd absorbed that. And I'd always found people obsessed with their family histories a bit tragic, actually, because for the most part, they're looking for distinction. They're trying to find some sort of connection. And that was very, very present in my mother's family because my grandmother's maiden name was Wedgwood. And talk to my grandmother and you would think that she was very, very closely related, not only to Josiah Wedgwood, but also to Charles Darwin, whose mother was a Wedgwood and married a Wedgwood. And if you know about the Wedgwoods, you know that Charles Darwin was really essentially a Wedgwood. And there was all of this stuff, and it was all just a bit silly and a bit of a joke and nauseating things. So the other reality is that very few of us know very much, actually, about our families when you go back to the great-great-grandfather stage. There are 16 great-great-grandparents, and like most families, we knew a bit about Jesus. We knew a bit about the Wedgwoods, and we knew quite a lot about the Marrs, and that was it. And my mother had talked about her grandmother's maiden name, which was Maud Ewer, spelt in the German Ur, U-H-R, pronounced in Australia Ewer. And by the way, the family is still deeply engaged in the genealogical work of proving that the antecedents of the Ewers were not German but Swedish. And that continues to this day. So there was just she had a joke that her grandmother's mother had been Minnie Mackenzie and she became Minnie Ewer. And my mother thought that was incredibly funny. She became Manure. And there was a very large house. It's still there, on the North Shore, where a great aunt of hers lived. When we passed that occasionally, my mother would say, you know, my great aunt lived there. It's a gigantic pile. Anyway, so knew nothing about the Ewers. My Uncle Jim knew nothing about the Ewers, knew nothing about his grandmother, but he did tell me that somebody had done a book on the Ewers. I borrowed a copy of the book, and on page 72 there's a picture of my great-great-grandfather in the uniform of the native police. And I just, it does hit you like a blow. And then I had this completely weird notion. I thought, maybe, I mean, I've read all the books. I said, maybe I've misunderstood who the native police are. And I know what I'll do. I went to Wikipedia. I went to native police. Not only were they exactly what I knew they were, but there was my great-great-grandfather and his brother, both as conspicuously appalling officers in the Queensland Native Police. So that's how I found out. What else do you want to know, ma'am?
Well, actually, the book does cover 4 of your ancestors in terms of that, and I wonder if you could also, you've identified the 2 that you write about that are engaged with the native police and are actually out there engaged with massacres and other atrocities on the frontier. But you've got 2 other ancestors that you write about in the book that are just as complicit but don't get their hands bloody.
I knew pretty much at once that the only reasonable response to this discovery was to write the story. I mean, I'm a story writer. That's my job. And that if I didn't write the story, I would be complicit. And the way not to be complicit was to expose, and to do so in as completely professional way as I could. No loyalties to this branch of the family, which I didn't know anyway. I mean, how different this story might have been if the crimes I had discovered were the crimes of my father or my grandmother or my grandfather, how different it might have been. But this is great-great-grandfather, and this is a long way back. It's 150 years back in time. And I knew at once that I would write this story. But the other thing I knew is that it was a story worth writing. I've been looking around for, waiting for inspiration to strike to do another big book. It's a long time since I've written a big book. And I knew at once, I didn't think it was going to be as big as that, but I knew at once that I would write it because I wanted to investigate it. And this was a subject that had long fascinated me. And race in Australian politics is something I've been writing about. I did my first article on race in Australian politics in the aftermath of the 1974 election, and 50 years ago, and I'd never thought to look in my own family's background. But I knew at once that I was going to do it. But what I then discovered was that if I looked more broadly at the family, so if I looked at the family, if I looked at the reasons for the Ewers being in Australia, I discovered a much richer narrative. Because what had happened was that a rich Sydney merchant called Richard Jones, and I ended up working at the Fairfax building on Jones Street, Pyrmont, which I discovered was named after Jones. Richard Jones was a rich Sydney merchant. He was the second president of the Bank of New South Wales. He was a member of the Governor's Legislative Council. And for reasons which no one can really understand, on a return trip to Britain, he met and married a poor girl from the London docks, really. She had a bunch of younger half-brothers, and they had all been sired by a German seaman who'd then disappeared. And these four boys were brought out by Mr. Jones as each of them became teenagers. The later ones he put through King's. He was one of the founders of King's. The earlier ones he put to work on his sheep stations. And he in his lifetime acquired 600,000 acres of land. He just took it. He had no hesitation taking it. He was a major Christian, etc., etc., etc. One of the founders of the Benevolent Society, one of the founders of the Australian Gaslight Company, good old AGL, still taking our money. And this opened to me the possibility, which I seized, that writing a family story would take me all through the politics of the early colony, the politics of land seizure, the politics that yielded nothing of benefit for the Aboriginal people. He also acquired the Sydney Gazette. He was an early newspaper proprietor. That allowed me to get into all of the great newspaper debate on Aborigines, which began in the 1805, 1806, 1807, and still continues in the press today. And let me tell you, the press come out of that debate very well. Not necessarily Mr. Jones, but they come out of it well. And that allowed me to go on a much longer journey through the family. The family provided a spine to tell a story that was not just about killing, but the politics of colonisation that led to it.
It's told in such a compelling way too, that you really do understand how the law and the people who are administering the law, who were making the laws, and then enforcing them, we're all a part of that same project. That really comes out in the book, in the story. Now, Matthew, it's a bit of a spoiler alert that you're on this panel, and it is about finding crime in the family tree. So I wonder if you could share with us the project you're working on and what it was that you discovered.
Well, I'm almost embarrassed in the shadow of David's absolutely brilliant and important book. Oh, shut up. And also, I'm still in the thick of research. But and David alluded to this stream of thought himself. So it's not until much later, as you get older and allegedly wiser, that you see things you didn't see before. So the catalyst for this investigation was my mother's death almost exactly a year ago. And in that sort of lunacy of post-death, there was this craziness. Mum passed away, Dad and Mum were living in an apartment at Main Beach on the Gold Coast. For some reason, there was an imperative to get my father out of the apartment and away from memories of Mum. and put him into a retirement village. And then there was the big clean out of 30 years of detritus in the apartment. And I was nominated the archivist. So down in the garage were dozens and dozens of boxes of documents, photographs, etc., etc. So I start opening these boxes, and I'm seeing photographs I've never seen, seeing documents, learning facts I never had a clue about. My family's not alone, I'm positive in this. And a picture kept coming up of this relative who I won't name. He's still got 3 living children. And he kept coming up, and I remembered him as this sort of frightening figure on the fringe of the family. And so I've gone through the boxes, and then I start thinking about why I wrote these 5 interconnected crime books. And during the research for them, I was going through, and it was an extraordinarily tedious job to go through Terry Lewis's police diaries when he worked in the Juvenile Aid Bureau from about 1961 to 1972. So 10 years of diaries, you know, clocked on at 8 a.m. and blah, blah, blah. Oh, it was incredibly dull. But about a third of the way through the diaries in the mid-1960s, I went, hang on, I know that name. And my relatives started turning up in these diaries, the names of my relatives, truancy, possible prostitution. So here they are. Here's my family intersecting directly with Terence Murray Lewis in the 1960s. In January 1974, the great floods of Brisbane, and my parents, we were living out at Samford, which is outside of Brisbane. The floods had cut us off, so my sister and I were staying with my grandmother, whom I talked about earlier, in a suburb called Rosalie in the inner west of Brisbane. We were cut off from our parents, so we had to stay with our grandmother. So I learned much later that at that exact moment that I'm holed up in the rain and the floods with my grandmother, 300 metres in the next street behind me lived the convicted triple murderer Vincent O'Dempsey. And at that exact time that I was staying there, a few hundred metres away, he had murdered a woman called Barbara McCulkin and her 2 daughters, slashed the girls' throats, raped the mother post-mortem, come back to the apartment 300 metres from my grandmother's house, packed it up, and he'd done a runner. So all this was happening around me when I was 12. We live in the Gap in Brisbane. I find out that in the next street lived the former police commissioner, corrupt commissioner Frank Bischoff. And all these years later in these books, I would expose Bischoff as a pedophile. So there was all of these touch points of this incredible story, and suddenly my family's names are a part of this story. So upon my mother's death, I'm discussing issues about this particular man on my mother's side of the family, and she was convinced that he, in fact, was responsible for very, very famous cold case murder in Brisbane, September 1952, a woman called Betty Shanks. It's still a cold case, unsolved. So I have many discussions with my cousin, and then I start investigating, and I find out that my this relative had in fact been incarcerated in the Westbrook farm home for boys outside of Toowoomba from 15 to 18, was in trouble with the police. I have his police records. And in 1947, he was convicted of attempted rape in Brisbane and sentenced to 7 years in jail. Now, I'll briefly, very quickly give you a sketch of the attempted rape. So this man is sitting, my relative is sitting at a tram stop. It's about 9 o'clock at night. This woman gets off a tram. She's a nurse. Her name was Mabel Mears Wilson, in her early 30s. very distinguished nurse, served in Korea in the Second World War. Walking to the private hospital where she worked, she's grabbed from behind, pulled to the ground, her knickers are ripped off, she's kicked in the head and punched in the head. She screams, neighbours come running, my relative flees, and to cut a long story short, he is ultimately arrested and convicted of this crime. He's released from jail in April 1952, and he's living with his parents in Windsor Road, Red Hill in Brisbane. In September 1952, Betty Shanks has come from town. She's been to a lecture. She gets off the tram. It's about 9:25 p.m. She's walking down Thomas Street towards her house. She's grabbed from behind, pulled to the ground. Her knickers are ripped off. She's punched and kicked in the head and dies. 20 minutes later, a man with blood covering his suit jacket and tie grabs a taxi and says, "Take me to Ashgrove." And they get to Ashgrove and he says, "I've changed my mind, take me to the Red Hill Post Office." He's dropped off there and he walks left and disappears in Windsor Road. So we have this incredible template of circumstantial evidence, and there's a lot more to it than that, suggesting that this relative indeed may be the Shanks killer that the police are still actively looking for after 72 years. And that in turn has led me down other research paths to relatives, and that is my investigation. But the book that this will become, I think, will ask some very serious questions about family secrets, about untold truths, and how, in fact, they can have huge ramifications through generations. How they can bend and alter a person's life, my life, even before I was born. And I'm just interested in that idea of past transgressions and the potential impact echoing into the future.
I want to obviously pick that up with David, but just one question to follow up, which comes off something that David said earlier, when he reflected it might have been a harder book for him to write if this had have been something that had been committed, but if the crimes had have been committed by his father. You're much closer to where this criminality is, and you mentioned that there are still family members that are alive. As you're writing this project, what sorts of processes do you go through, or how are you navigating the fact that there are people still alive who are going to be closely connected with what you're writing about?
Well, it's always on my mind, but my rationale is, look, I'm just going to write it. I'm going to find out everything that I can find. I'll write it and then make a decision about what to do with it. I mean, I need to find this out, whether it's published or not. So it would just clarify a lot of things about not just the family, but about myself and who I am and some of my motivations. So it's important in that sense, but incredibly difficult already to navigate and tiptoe through, this little family minefield. But my thoughts at the moment are just to not worry about that and just to continue and pursue the investigation.
Makes sense. Matthew reflects that something that happens generations before will shape the generations that come. As you know, David, one of the things I really like about your book is that it is it's a very detailed, it's a very forensic account of what's in the archive. It is very frank about the crimes that have been committed, both the ones that are on the frontier, but also the ones that are committed through the use of law, etc. So I wonder if you could share with us your reflections on what it means to find that family history, and how do you position yourself with what you found?
Well, really one of the things that crops up again and again and again and again, which you mentioned a moment ago, which is family secrets. And family secrets are extraordinary because they work. What a family chooses not to talk about becomes the family secret, and somehow it is not transmitted to the next generation. And I do not know whether my mother knew that her great-grandfather was an officer in the Queensland Native Police. She may have known. Certainly her grandmother knew, must have known. And since the book has come out, I've met lots more of my relatives from the Ewer side of the family. And I was talking the other day to a 93-year-old cousin, God knows, third, fourth, fifth, sixth cousin, 93-year-old cousin, who remembers my great-grandmother well, and we had a bit of a chat about my great-grandmother. You always find things after a book is published. And he said, oh yes, that photograph of Reg in his native police unit, we've always had that. He lives in Newport, he's still got it. You know, the photograph is there. He's about to get a call from the Australian Museum. Because the Australian Museum, I've already put the Australian Museum onto a weapons collector in Newcastle who has Reg Ewer's native police ceremonial sword. But secrets work. When I was about 17 years old, I said to my grandmother, who's that? And it was the photograph of a young man in Air Force uniform on her mantelpiece. I just sort of hadn't noticed it, mantelpiece of a bedroom. And she said, oh, that's my brother, Don. I never knew I had a great uncle, Don. Don had been a pilot, he'd gone to the war, he'd had a very distinguished record as a Spitfire pilot, had come back an absolute mess, tried to top himself, damaged his brain, survived, and at the time I asked about the photograph, he was working as a gardener in a convent on the North Shore somewhere. I never met him, he died. But families can keep secrets easily. If everybody has agreed we don't talk about this, that knowledge does not get passed down. So here's me and Matthew climbing back up the tree looking for what we can discover. And I had no second thoughts about what I was discovering. I mean, it never crossed my mind that I not use material that I had discovered. It had to be total. It also had to be good judgment, and the usual judgment, well, as good as I can make it, because this was a work of journalism. I've called it the longest National Times article in the existence of the modern press. But that's what it had to be. That's what the rules of it had to be. It would have been useless without those rules. And the technical challenge for me was to bring alive characters about whom very little was actually known. Of course, with the gorgeous engine of Trove, you can now find so much about people, particularly if they had, and I find this extraordinary in my family, a bit of a lust for publicity. And my great-great-uncle, Darcy Ewer, an appalling man in every way, an appalling man, but a man of great charm. He was never punished for any of his crimes. He was a killer of Aborigines, both as an officer in the Native Police and then later as a drover and a miner in Western Australia, never punished for any of his crimes, boasted about them in the press. His role was always heroic, and as you got very close to the actual murders, the hitherto brilliant detail of the accounts evaporated, so that, you know, there was only the vaguest notion of what happens at the denouement of the stories, but anybody reading the stories would know. So I was able to find out a great deal about it. It never crossed my mind not to use the material in the most professional way that I could. But by this time I had become quite good friends with, and indebted to for his help, a Ewer relative who had spent his life investigating much of the same material in order to come to a very different conclusion about his great-grandfather, who was Darcy, great-great-grandfather, who was Darcy. And he was committed to the notion that Darcy was a colonial scamp, you know, a naughty boy, a bit of a rogue, but certainly not a mass murderer. And in the end, he was the only relative to fall out strongly with me, partly because of my partner who was helping me with the book, Sebastian Tesoriero, who is not a man given to charm. And God knows how I found him. And at one stage, Frank Ewer had written us a letter, say, you know, defending Darcy, and it was just too much for Sebastian. And he just wrote him this fantastic letter, this fantastic email. Frank, I want you to know that I think Darcy is in every way a despicable human being, was how it began. It went on from there. But the Ewer family have mostly come along with the book, but I couldn't have given a flying, whatever we say these days in polite company, whether they did or didn't. My main concern was with my immediate family. And when I first briefed them on what I was doing near the beginning, they said, David, must you? I've embarrassed them a lot over the years, and this was looming as another of my embarrassments, but a bad one. But in the end, they were completely on board.
As you say, David, both you and Matthew have gone through climbed up your family tree. These are personal works. I'm going to invite you both to give a little reading. Hopefully, Matthew, you're able to share something. There's a copy of your book right here, David, for you to find something.
We weren't warned about.
Oh, yes, if you read the email I sent you, you were warned.
Well, Matthew's going first here
Because have a book.
Because he will have prepared. Look at that heap. And I use the word heap advisedly. Look at that heap. Can I just reflect on one thing while I'm thinking? I'm not a great reader of crime novels. I mean, you know, every now and again, yes, and Peter Temple, of course, and, you know, it's, I want that heap. But what interests me is that most crime novels are written around the question of who did it. This is written around the question of why weren't they punished? We know who did it. They knew who did it. It was not a secret. And I'm about to deliver a speech to the County Court judges of Victoria next week, and this is very much on my mind. And you mentioned it earlier, but why didn't the law act to punish? Also, of course, the recent report on robo-debt makes me think the same thing. How can those people not be punished for knowingly breaking the law for 6 or 7 years and causing over $1 billion worth of improper collections of money from people least able to pay it? But that's beside the point, really. But this is a history where whodunit is no mystery. Why weren't they punished is the deeper question here. And in my view, and maybe Matthew, you were referring to this earlier, but in my view, Queensland begins not just with blood, but very deliberate lawlessness. The first Attorney General of Queensland, a man called Radcliffe Pring, who was a London barrister sent out here because he had a bad chest. There's a very good book to be written sometime about the appalling people who came to Australia in the 19th century because of their chests. But Radcliffe Pring says, there is no legislative basis for the work of the native police. He admitted they were operating outside the law, and they did. They operated outside the law for 60 years. There was never a legislative basis for what they did. Now, you say something while I try and find something.
No, I mean that's a fascinating point for me, because the natural extension of that in David's book is why this happened in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and onwards. And that's why when I read David's book, he went to the very, very heart of the origins of what my work has been and we're talking the absolute origins, and that's, the lawlessness, the brutality, and the relationship with the governing figures of the day. And when I read that in David's book, I thought, that's what I've been writing about, as recently as the 1990s. So, I mean, the echoes of history are extraordinary, and particularly in Queensland. And that was one of many profound moments that I found in David's book. It just hit me between the eyes, and I thought, of course, that makes complete sense.
It was a society, typically a colonial society, where there was a notion that things had to be done that were necessary, and that whether they were lawful was a second issue consideration. But these things had to be done. And so you went out and you killed on the frontier because it was necessary.
How can you the role of Queensland cops in Australia?
Oh, the role of Queensland. Look, actually, a very important part of the Native Police story is that the Native Police were administered for the first 35 years of Queensland's existence by the same man, a man called David Seymour. And he was a Brit, of course. Everybody was a Brit. But he was a very astute bureaucrat. And one of the reasons that the Native Police survived, the almost constant complaint and criticism about their work, was the skill with which Seymour got rid of the most notorious officers, who kept things a bit under control, who shifted officers around, they'd made idiots of themselves in one district, he sent them to another. He was a very, very skilled public administrator, but just none of that is solving my problems of finding something to read.
Well, in fact, we're running out of time, David, so you might have solved it for yourself unless you find something quickly.
All right. The origins of Queensland. Cannons barked as Sir George Bowen's steamer came up the Brisbane River. He was days late. Bunting hung limp in the heat. News that he was finally on his way brought 4,000 people to the Botanic Gardens to watch his portly figure come ashore. The cheers that were given were worthy of any company of loyal Britishers all the world over, gushed the Moreton Bay Courier. Sir George was a protege of the statesman William Ewart Gladstone, sent to the far side of the world with a singular brief, to set up a colony, as he said, full-blown from the beginning. There was little revenue and only 25,000 settlers to fill a territory 3 times the size of France. London picked a man in love with empire. Bowen saw Britain's colonies circling the globe as an almost sublime manifestation of Christian civilization. Another 21 guns fired as the Bowens made their way through the gardens. No colourful natives had been mustered to welcome them, though Aboriginal people in the new colony outnumbered whites by about 8 to 1. As the viceregal couple reached the steps of Government House, a nurse brought their baby out to be kissed. "Sir, that was a touch I couldn't stand," wrote a weary journalist. "It would have melted the heart of a wheelbarrow." They're the bits that keep you reading between the slaughters.
This is just a paragraph. Bear in mind, please forgive me. These are raw thoughts and notes. But I started this when I started toying with the idea of writing this as a book after Mum died. So I'm writing about being denied truth in your life, and how some members of your family exist on the edge, and as I've written, like to catch the warmth at the edge of a fire, never getting too close, never risking or getting burnt. And I write that as a journalist and a writer, I've dedicated much of my life to seeking the truth, coming at it from different angles, working out ways to get closer to the source without destroying relationships or indeed yourself. You take a sledgehammer to the fringes of the story and hammer your way in layer by layer. And there comes a point where you can't go any further. That there is a tensile junction of wiring that keeps everything necessarily in balance. It keeps it from flying apart. That raw wiring is the heart of the lie. It hums along those wires. And basically I say there is potentially a point where you either make a decision to snip the wire and potentially detonate the bomb, basically. So these are early stages of me trying to wrestle with how to, or indeed if, to attack this story.
Thank you. Just finally, David, your book is about your family, but it is also about Australia. Yep. And I just wonder if we could get a reflection from you about, which I know you sort of write about it at the end of your book, but just your reflection on what it means to us as a country to confront this history.
The one thing I think that would that sense of a ship travelling in a certain direction and it's wrong, the direction is wrong, but it doesn't take much of a shift of direction to begin to solve everything that voyage encompasses as bad. And if we could just understand that we're a conquered country, that's all it takes. I'm sorry, that's not all it takes. But that is the perfect starting point for the reappraisal of our history and also, of course, to what has not been done in Australia, uniquely not done in Australia, where the bit of the empire where there has never been a reckoning with the conquered. Everywhere else there's been reckonings. In North America, both in the United States and in Canada, reckonings. Reckonings in New Zealand, reckonings in South Africa, reckonings. But this country can't come to a reckoning. And I think that process, which has to happen, would begin if we could just, through not just my book, but through, the wonderful work of historians that have been writing on this subject since the 1980s. This now is a 45-year project to just understand this is a conquered country. And then the politics goes in a different direction. The obligations, the decent obligations that the conquerors owe to the conquered become clear, and we can fix the past. I think that the effort of forgetting the past takes a lot of our moral energy. And I think that's over. I really think it's over. Something extraordinary has happened. That book that Sebastian and I worked on has been now nearly published for a year. There hasn't been a whisper from the Quadrant crowd that it's a black armband, left-wing, pessimistic invention designed to destroy Australia's reputation. Not a whisper. Not a whisper in any review the book has had. Now, I've said this before, they are maybe preparing a D-Day invasion of such violence that, we will all reel and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I actually think the history wars are done. I think they're done. If you're not going to attack that book, you've given up. And maybe that's, and I'm not saying because of the brilliance of the book, of course it is brilliant, but I think time has passed. And I think the frontier wars are now looking, the frontier history wars are now looking really grubby.
Thank you. That's a lovely note for us to wind up on. Both of you have spoken about stories that are very close to yourselves and to your families, and you've done that with such generosity with us today. I've known David for many years and I've always been charmed by him. He's very charming. I've only just met Matthew.
She's not,
No, I'm terrible.
She's so
it's a nasty
hard,
email
so rugged,
saying you're going to be doing a reading and she would ignore. I'd not met Matthew before today, but as you can see, I was a bit of a fan, and they say don't meet your heroes, but wrong on this account. Absolutely charmed by you too. And I'm sure everyone else who's had the privilege of listening to you both for this past hour will have shared that feeling of being really enriched by the generosity with which you've shared your stories. So can you please join me in thanking Matthew Condon and David Marr.